All right, folks, we will let others straggle in as they may. Welcome to our education series. Brian, Quinn, thank you for helping us do this virtually. I'm sure everyone continues to do this, but the board's also monitoring the data around the spread of COVID-19. This is my disclaimer for the UPZS crew. We've noted the current position of the state of South Carolina. We will continue to acknowledge the severity of the pandemic and treat it accordingly. This is a brew club, it's not critical business. We will resume our regular in-person events in the very near future. Until then, we'll do our best to accommodate and educate virtually like we are going to tonight. We encourage everyone who's in quarantine and brewing to post pictures, do Facebook Live, Instagram, share some stories, hashtag UPZS. If you're out and about at some of the local establishments picking up your growlers and crowlers, make sure you're taking pictures and spreading love. That's our small part that we can do to help give back as a club. So for our agenda tonight, we're only going to do education with Q&A. I'm going to go through the normal Zoom rules for virtual meetings. Make sure you're on mute unless you need to talk. Unmute your lines if you want to ask a question. If a moderator has to mute your line, raise your hand to be unmuted for that question. And if at all possible, save your questions till the end. I know that sometimes if you got a burning question for Brian and it makes sense to plug it in, by all means, ask. Try to consolidate your questions. We'll do a formal Q&A at the end. We're also doing a contest tonight. I think some of you may have seen on Facebook, but in a small effort to support our local breweries, we purchased 5 raffle tickets for Brew Day with our guest speaker, Brian. The Brew Day will be at Town Brewing. I believe you'll get a chance to help do some recipe design with Brian. And then you'll be invited to the release day as well. The tickets are going to be drawn at the end of the meeting. This is not just a UPZS contest. This is something that Brian and Town are doing locally. So it's not like one of the 20 of us or so here are guaranteed to win, but you're going to get a chance, 5 of us. So with that said, again, I wanted to harp on the supporting local one more time before we get into education. We're playing a fairly significant part as a brew club. We're trying to keep the lights on some of these establishments that are having a hard time getting rid of their beer right now. So continue to support when you're out and about. Take those pictures, hashtag them, put them out on social media. See whatever we can, grassroots help market for these folks. All right, tonight's guest. Let me introduce the head brewer for Town Brewing, Brian Quinn. I've got a few things that I stole off the interwebs. Brian grew up in Huntersville and is a native Charlottean. He graduated from the Siebel Institute for Master Brewing. He's a fan of all things fermented and enjoys making kombucha, pickles, and hot sauces. And the most unique ingredient he's used to brew to date are scuppernong grapes with a sour saison. The stage is yours, Brian.
Awesome. Well, first, let me just thank everyone for organizing this and helping us to find ways to at least virtually interact during this very strange time. And definitely thank you to everyone who's been going out and supporting not just us at Town, but all of your local breweries. We're all doing our best to try to get by with to-go sales right now and just adapting to a lot of the limitations and restrictions that have been placed on us, but hopefully we'll be able to get through this quickly, and definitely appreciate everyone's support during this time. I'll just go ahead and dive right into to the presentation. Brad already went ahead and gave a quick introduction of myself. I'm the head brewer, director of brewery operations here over at Town Brewing. Just for a little bit more background info, I went to North Mech for high school, went off to UNC for my undergrad, and then Virginia Tech actually went for a master's in history. So actually, one of the main reasons why I fell in love with beer early on was because I feel like it really represents a unique combination of history, science, and culinary creativity. So that really just kind of meshed well with my interests. So we can just briefly start by discussing a little bit about the history of lagers. As a history nut, the history of lagers and kind of the Pilsner style in particular has always been something that's been really, really fascinating to me. Nowadays, we think of lagers as kind of a family of beer brewed with lager yeast, Saccharomyces pastorianus. But before lager was really a word used to describe a family of beers, lagering was a process. It referred to the cold storage and cold conditioning of beer. Lagering as a brewing technique definitely predates the use of the word lager as to denote a family of beers. Lagering was occurring in cool caves in the medieval area and was especially popular among Bavarian brewers. And probably the reason for this was that those cooler temperatures really aided in limiting the growth of any unwanted beer spoilage microbes, your wild yeast, your lactobacillus, those microbes that would naturally have gotten into beer in the past when sanitation practices and stainless steel and people were brewing in wood. There was open air fermentation. There was naturally going to be some wild yeast and wild bacteria character in the beers of the past. But that cool conditioning and storing it in those cool caves definitely limited some of the growth, which ultimately resulted in a more flavorful product in the end. So cold conditioning or lagering a beer on its yeast for a few weeks, one thing that really does is help that beer to drop bright and go crystal clear. It also allows for a number of other biochemical processes that really mellow out the flavor and aroma in the finished beer. Acetaldehyde, for example, a lot of that is reabsorbed during a long lagering process. And a lot of the organic acids in beer, there's some esterification that happens during the lagering process as well. So the end result is typically a more mellow, subtle flavor than you would get with a typical warmer ale fermentation. One of the things that I find extremely interesting about lager yeast in particular, and that to be clear is the biggest difference here, really the only difference between an ale and lager is that they're fermented with different species of brewing yeast. Ale yeast is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, whereas lager yeast is Saccharomyces pastorianus. Many of you know that I'm sure that ale yeast tends to ferment more quickly at warmer temperatures relative to lager yeast, which ferments at cooler temperatures for longer periods of time. Ales tend to produce more fruity esters and phenols than lagers as well, resulting in definitely a fruitier, more flavorful product, typically. The interesting thing, basically since we began brewing beer as humans, ale yeast of some sort and wild yeast, those were the main, that was the main species of yeast that was used to make beer. Saccharomyces pastorianus, or lager yeast, didn't emerge till much later, actually pretty relatively recently in the grand history of our 7,000 years of brewing as human civilization. The Saccharomyces pastorianus, that all lager strains are part of that species, emerged as a result of hybridization between ale yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and Saccharomyces eubayanus. And that particular yeast was discovered in Patagonia in 2011. So it was only in 2011 when we realized that the genetic origins of this lager yeast actually hailed from the Saccharomyces eubayanus from Patagonia, mating with the Saccharomyces cerevisiae, or ale yeast, that was common in brewing. It had a 99% genetic match. So the current theory is that the Saccharomyces eubayanus hopped a ride on a ship back in the early days of the age of exploration and found its way back from the Americas to Europe and made its way into the brewing cultures of of Central Europe, resulting in the creation of lager yeast. It was, it's also worth noting that the fact that these brewers were cold conditioning these beers and often fermenting these beers in those cooler caves, ale yeast doesn't really function well at those temperatures. So the fact that brewers were attempting to brew at those temperatures basically selected for those that lager yeast strain and gave it an environment to really thrive and become more dominant in. So real quick, I can go back to that last slide for one quick second. A lot of people think of the difference between lager and ale yeast as a bottom fermenting versus top fermenting. They talk about it in those terms. I think that kind of really kind of muddies the waters a little bit. People will say, oh, lager yeast ferments from the bottom, whereas ale yeast ferments from the top. That's not really true. In any fermenting wort, there's a lot of convective activity that's happening. Those yeast cells are throughout the entire solution. There are certain ale strains that are good for top cropping or better for harvesting from the top of a brew rather than harvesting from the bottom. So some people could argue that that's a slight difference between ale yeast and lager yeast, but really most commercial breweries aren't doing a lot of top cropping. Some traditional English spots certainly are, and there's some of that occurring with German Hefeweizens, but most commercial brewers are either propping up yeast or harvesting off of the bottoms of their tanks. Wanted to just real quick dive into some of the technological and scientific advances that led to lager becoming one of the most popular styles in beer. If you want to hop to the next slide, Rick, thanks. So nowadays, by sales volume, lager beer styles are the number one selling beer styles in the world. But this was not always the case. As we've mentioned, ale yeast was, from the earliest days of brewing, that was the brewer's yeast strain of choice. So what led to lagers becoming the dominant beer styles of the world? A number of things all really happening in the 19th century, and it kind of really goes in tandem with a lot of just the industrialization of the brewing process. In the mid-19th century, refrigeration technology finally emerged. Up till that point, brewers were actually hauling ice down from the mountains to fill up their caves. I don't know if anyone's been to the cellars at Pilsner or Quell. That picture on the title page was actually from Pilsner or Quell. They were carting in a whole bunch of ice from the mountains to keep their beer cool. Eventually, when refrigeration technology started becoming a thing and becoming more, available commercially in the 1850s and 1860s, brewers and meat processing plants were the first early adopters of that technology. Another very, very important scientific advancement, not just for brewing lagers, but for brewing in general, was that finally in 1883, Emil Christian Hansen, working out at a Carlsberg lab, isolated a single cell of Saccharomyces pastorianus, that's lager yeast. And his practices, building off the work of Louis Pasteur, really enabled brewers for the first time to control the microbes that they were putting into their beer and only ferment out their wort with one strain of brewing yeast rather than some ale yeast, probably some wild yeast, some other bacteria as well. There were also other advances in malting that were happening. British malt houses were kind of the first to develop a indirect heat kilning method for malting, where they were kilning their malt over coke to produce a paler malt. That was very important in the British Isles in terms of the emergence of pale ales in the 18th century as a very popular style. But eventually Czech and German brewers adopted, or maltsters adopted some of those practices, leading to the creation of that pale Pilsner malt that was so important to the emergence of the Pilsner style from Pilsen in 1842. Glass making, interestingly enough, also during the 19th century became a lot cheaper, and so consumers for the first time now were able to buy, glassware as a serving vessel for their beer. Up till that point, when you're drinking beer out of stoneware or a horn, the aesthetics of that beer weren't nearly as important. But when you're pouring it into a clear glass, some of that clarity really started to resonate with the consumer. Transportation advances were also extremely important in the industrialization of beer, not just in terms of being able to move beer out more widely from larger breweries, but also being able to just frankly move people all around the world. You look at lager styles from Mexico, you look at the lager styles of the US, most of these styles were German inspired or and breweries started by German immigrants. And during the 19th century, there was just a lot of changes in consumer preference around beer. Those lager styles definitely were mellower, more subdued in their flavor. They didn't have some of the off flavors associated with wild yeast and wild bacteria. And there was also just kind of a general perception that Bavarian brewers were the masters of the brewing world. And as such, the German love of the lager beer style really spread as well. German reunification in the, I believe, 1870s also made Reinheitsgebot kind of the law of the land across Germany, which resulted in a lot of historic styles in Germany kind of becoming a thing of the past, going extinct, especially the ale styles, historic ale styles. And you just had this kind of wave of what I like to call Pilsnerification spreading across the world as that light Pilsner style became so much more dominant. There are so many different lager styles out there. They range just the full gamut of colors. They can be light, amber, dark. You can have session strength lagers. You can have high gravity lagers, hoppy lagers, malty and sweet lagers. This is just a very, very broad family of beers. It's, I know personally it can be kind of challenging to kind of explain that to a consumer. Many consumers have this idea of lager as just light lawnmower type beer, and that's largely because that's, macro breweries and macro lager, light lager are it's the most dominant beer style in the world. But it's I've always loved just exploring just the full range of styles that are out there and available with lagers, and we've been very fortunate lately. Craft lagers, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, but lagers at craft breweries are becoming more and more common. Out to the next slide there. So we've discussed that lager is the most popular beer style in the world, and yet when you look at craft breweries, the majority of them are producing ales. And when you ask, there's a lot of reasons why that might be. One of the biggest reasons is tank capacity. If a lager takes 6 to 8 weeks to make and an ale takes 2 or 3 weeks to make, obviously a brewer that's a little bit tight on tank space is going to favor brewing ales over lagers because they can put out a lot more volume at that point in time. But I think it's also kind of important to consider the fact that one of the main reasons why ale styles early on in the craft beer revolution were the main styles that craft brewers were tackling is because this was a very conscious break on the part of craft brewers to kind of distance themselves away from macro beer and macro lager. They wanted to provide the consumer with something that was fundamentally different from what they were getting. So a lot of people ask me nowadays, what do you think are good, like entry level kind of craft beer styles? A lot of people think blonde ales or even light craft lagers are a good entry point. And yes, while it's true it might be good to kind of convert some of the macro lager drinkers a little bit, I think when people are making a choice to reach for a craft beer over a macro lager, they want that big difference. They want that big juxtaposition in flavor, and they want an intensity of flavor. So I've actually found more often than not, and this is probably another reason why IPA is the most popular style in craft beer, but the gateway drug into craft beer seems to me to be a little bit more IPA centric than something like a lighter blonde ale. But beyond some of the commercial restraints that have kept a lot of craft breweries from tackling lagers, mostly tank capacity, homebrewers have a lot of limitations on this as well. Not everyone has the fermentation chambers or any ability to control their fermentation temperature. And temperature control, while it's very key for brewing ales, is even more important for brewing lagers, because most people just simply don't have their room temperature in the 50-degree range. So it's also just a real practice in patience for lagers, because they take significantly longer time. I know I didn't brew a lot of lagers when I was a home brewer, simply because, you know, I didn't want to have that sitting around in my fermentation chamber for 2 months when I could have made, you know, 3 other beers in that amount of time. One thing that I really preach is that when anyone's going into a new brewery for the first time, if they've got a Pilsner on or a lighter lager, that is definitely by far the best beer to judge that brewer by. Lagers in general just don't hide their flaws as well as a heavily hopped IPA or a big adjunct pastry stout. So if you really want to get a true feel for the skill of a brewer, you should drink some of their lighter styles, like a Pilsner, like a light lager, maybe like a blonde ale, because they are just much less forgiving and just don't hide the flaws as much as some of those other craft styles do. One thing that not everyone obviously at home has the ability to do step mashing, but yeah, I know personally I did mostly just you know, single infusion brewing when I was a home brewer, where you mash in and rest at one temperature to convert your starch to sugar, typically in the 148 to 162 degree range. But if we're talking about lagers, it's worth noting some of these other popular mash regimes. Decoction mashing, in particular, has always been a very traditional way to brew lagers. The German and Czech brewers have always been very big on decoction mashing, and it was also definitely used more in the past when malt was just less well modified than it is today. Under-modified malt benefited from a decoction mash to break down some of the proteins, break down some of the starches, and allow that brewer to increase their efficiency. In a decoction mash, you typically pull off a third of the mash volume, boil that, and then reinfuse that with the main mash to step up the temperature. There's double decoction, there's a triple decoction. A triple decoction essentially means that there would be 4 different temperature steps. So you'd mash in, you do a total mash, and then you'd pull off a third of that volume, boil that, add that back in to go up to your next step, rest there, pull off volume, boil it, add it back in to get your temperature up to that next step. Most brewers nowadays, at least, you know, I'm of the impression that decoction mashing, typically more than anything else, is just a waste of time and energy utilities. Decoction mashing takes a lot longer on a brew day, and you know, you're also using obviously a lot more energy to heat that mash over and over again for each decoction. There's also some other negatives involved with decoction mashing. It will darken your color a little bit. You might get some more melanoid in character, which can be a plus or a negative depending on what you're ultimately after. You're definitely going to extract some more tannins by boiling the husks in that grain. We'll get into step mashing in a second. I just wanted to bring up quickly serial mashing. There's not a lot of craft brewers that are doing serial mashes. I know Legion actually has a cereal masher at their location. I'm not sure if they regularly use that for any true cereal mashing, but with products like corn grist or rice, you need to essentially boil or heat a little bit more heavily than you would a typical mash those grains to enable to gelatinize the grains and break down their starches. And then you can return that cereal mash to your main mash that has, you know, the enzymes present on barley malt to finish that conversion. You know, the big macro brewers out there, they're going to be doing cereal mash. Budweiser's going to be doing it with rice. And that cereal mash, that rice can make up, you know, 30–40% of the total grain bill. But it doesn't have the same enzyme or protein character that you might find with barley. A lot of times those big macro spots are adding enzymes into the mash as well to help convert some of that starch from the rice or the corn grits into sugar. So step mashing, and we actually do a lot of step mashing here at Town. Step mashing is essentially just applying heat to the mash to increase its temperature, resting at multiple different temperatures during the course of the mash. Sure, some of you might have rims or herms setups. We at Town here have a steam jacketed mash tun. There's also direct fire mash tuns out there as well. That, you know, our steam jacketed mash tun, when we mash in, we can mash in at a cooler temperature. We've got the impellers going to get it well homogenized and mixed, and then you know, after we've done each step, we can turn that steam on and just quickly raise that temperature up to the next step. A protein rest is the first step that a lot of brewers that are doing a step mash are going to do. That protein rest typically happens between 122 and 131 degrees Fahrenheit. In practice, I tend to go on the higher end of that range at 131. That's breaking down longer chain proteins into medium chain proteins, which is going to be good for head retention. It may have some negatives in terms of beer clarity, but I've found that for the most part, you can still get a pretty clear beer with that. If you're going at the lower end of that protein rest, closer to 122, you're going to be breaking down medium chain proteins into smaller proteins, which can be good for yeast health. So nowadays, you don't really need to do a protein rest with most of the malts that are pretty well modified. Question? All right. Yeah, most of the malts out there are pretty well modified, so this is a step that a lot of brewers skip. I usually only do a protein rest at Town when we're brewing something like a lager or like maybe like a German Hefeweizen. And then you've got your Saccharification rest step. That's obviously the most important step of the mash because that's where you're converting your starch into sugar, which is alpha amylase, one of the mash enzymes, operates ideally between 154 and 162 degrees. Beta amylase, another mash enzyme, operates between 131 and 150 degrees. A lot of the mash temps in a single infusion mash are going to kind of split the difference there and you know, find kind of an average where both of those enzymes are working a little bit. Many of you know that if you mash at a lower temperature in the 147, 148 to 149 degree range, you're going to get a drier beer with more fermentable wort. If you mash a little bit higher, say around 156, you're going to get a sweeter beer with a little bit more body and ultimately a less fermentable wort. One thing that I have really enjoyed doing that a lot of other brewers do not mess around with all that much with is a glycoprotein rest at 161 to 162 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's actually, I found that to be very helpful in terms of increasing head retention in a beer. It's also kind of fortunate that it's still within that alpha amylase range, so you're kind of killing two birds with one stone at that point in time. And then and that glycoprotein rest typically do that for about 20 to 30 minutes. So these step mashes, they do add a significant amount of time to your brew day. Protein rest might be anywhere from, 15 to 20 minutes. Saccharification rest, a lot of people are just, it's going to be at least, probably 40, 45 minutes, sometimes longer. I typically check conversion with an iodine test for that. And then a 10-minute mash out at the end just to denature those enzymes and shut off any enzymatic activity at that point. Another big difference between ale fermentation and lager fermentation is the pitch rates are significantly different. With an ale, you're going to have about 750,000 cells per milliliter of wort per degree Plato. It's twice that for a lager. I found that a lot of home brewers tend to underpitch even their ale yeast. So if you're planning on doing a lager, it's definitely advisable to make a starter and use significantly more yeast than you would with an ale. As far as a fermentation schedule, ale yeast, that ferments out pretty quickly, usually in the mid to upper 60s and you'll get through a primary fermentation in 3 to 5 days. Lagers, as a product of their cooler fermentation temperature, typically ferment out a little bit more slowly. Primary fermentation will last about 7 to 10 days. The ideal temperature range for primary fermentation is definitely yeast strain dependent, but it's usually around 48 degrees to 55 degrees. There's some lager strains that will ferment down as cool as 38 degrees. There's others that, don't have much issue fermenting closer to 60 degrees. It just depends on the strain and what kind of ultimately, flavor profile you're after. Typically, if you can keep it a little bit cooler, you're going to have a cleaner, more neutral final product. There are some breweries that will knock out their lagers a little bit warmer at around 60 degrees Fahrenheit before dropping it down to their primary fermentation temp the next day. The goal with that is to kind of shorten the lag time of your fermentation, and it allows a brewer to pitch slightly less yeast because it's going to have a little bit more active growth at that warmer temperature. I personally am not a huge fan of doing that. I'd rather just pitch the right amount of yeast, make sure it's a very healthy culture with high viability, make sure it's got its yeast nutrients and it's been well aerated. And if you're doing all of that right, I think you can just go in at around 48 or 50 degrees for your knockout with pretty good results. I typically choose to do a gradual ramp up during a lager fermentation. And about every other day, I'll increase the temperature by 2 degrees up until the end where you get to your diacetyl rest at around 60 to 62 degrees and allow that yeast to reabsorb that diacetyl for about 2 to 5 days before cold crashing. Once you cold crash that down, that's when your conditioning or lagering phase begins. I like to drop my temperatures on my lagers down to about 30 degrees. Beer doesn't usually, it depends on the ABV, but beer doesn't freeze until 26 degrees or so. So if you can get it down cold, you're gonna see a benefit in terms of clarity and a nice smooth mellow lager as your end result. Obviously, not everyone can get down to 30 degrees, but you want to get that as cold as you possibly can, as well without freezing your beer, of course. At that point in time, you can lager the beer for anywhere from 4 to 12 weeks. I know there are some breweries out there that try to go pretty quick, and they'll turn a lager in 30, 32 days. I typically try to be a little bit more patient with it, and we'll go 6 to 8 weeks for the most part for my lagers. Longer if it's a higher gravity lager. Got a Baltic Porter in tank right now that's been in there for a little over 2 months now. We'll probably give it a few more weeks before it's ready. I come across this fun little graphic from time to time, and I has always resonated a lot with me, just that evolution of beer snobs or craft beer drinkers. You know, everyone starts off with those macro lagers, then they get exposed to the wide world of IPA and big pastry stouts and sours, and eventually it all just comes full circle and people get back to the lagers. And fortunately, we're living in an amazing time where you don't have to necessarily compromise your values and can still support local while drinking high quality lager beer. There are just so many craft breweries that are now finally exploring the world of lager beer. We've really you've got your Haze Bros out there now. Of course, you've got what people call the crispy boy or the lager fan. Craft lagers have definitely been on the rise. They've been trending for recent years. And I think that definitely from what I've seen market to market, the more mature a beer market is, the more popular craft lagers seem to be. So to me, the popularity of craft lagers is really the sign of a maturing craft beer market. And so why are breweries all of a sudden, craft breweries, deciding to brew more lagers than they had in the past? I think this is a big product of just really rapid, almost unbridled growth within the craft beer industry. We're at a point right now where some estimates say that there's anywhere from 30 to 50% of the tank capacity out there being either not utilized or underutilized by breweries. So when you finally have a lot of breweries realizing that they do in fact have the capacity to put out lagers, especially since they tend to be styles that brewers themselves really enjoy, you've got kind of a recipe for why craft lagers in particular are probably trending. I think the other thing that's kind of led to the growth of craft lagers has been a bit of a price war. And I think this is really well illustrated by Founder's efforts with their Solid Gold premium lager. This is definitely priced kind of between your macro and then your kind of first tier of craft pricing. So it's been priced very aggressively. You've got other some more local examples: Burial Intertube, Higher Wire, Old North. A lot of breweries are exploring these kind of light, easy drinking lager styles, often using some kind of throwback retro feel labels to kind of evoke some of that nostalgia for some of the old lager beers of the in the U.S. But I've just really loved seeing how many brewers are tackling classic lager styles. They're doing India Pale lagers. Italian Pilsners have suddenly become a thing, and I find that one particularly weird because they're not widespread in Italy. It's that one craft brewery, Brewerification, whatever it's called, over there that made one. I guess Firestone's Pivo Pils was kind of modeled after that, and that those Italian Pilsners, I believe Resident Culture and Wooden Robot might have just done a collab that's a Italian Pilsner. It's just a dry hopped Pilsner that's dry hopped at cold temperatures. A lot of brewers have been really excited about that style. It's kind of one that's not been on my horizon to potentially be able to slip into the brew schedule here eventually. And then you've got just a lot of other craft breweries that are playing around with hoppier Pilsner styles that rather than just using traditional noble hops, they're seeing what a Pilsner hopped with Citra or Centennial or any number of New World hops might do to it. And I've personally really enjoyed experimenting with that. We did a Pilsner recently with some Australian Ella hops and some Huel Melon, and it had a lot of really cool white grape notes from the hops and some cool fruity character that was really refreshing and pleasant. Just wanted to open it up at this point in time to any questions about lager brewing, lager history, some of the things that have kind of caught your interest regarding, you know, how craft brewers have been, you know, attacking the challenge of brewing lagers and putting out new and exciting lager styles. So yeah, I don't know if, Rick, are you going to kind of moderate these questions as they come in?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. So everybody's pretty much muted. If you want to unmute yourself, that's fine to ask a question. If you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you too. So whatever.
Yeah, I have a question. Brian, on the cryoprotein rest at the 161 degrees.
The glycoprotein, yep.
Yeah, is that what you do before the mash out?
Yes.
So how long would you do the protein cryo rest? Let's say you're going to mash out at 150 degrees for simplicity, and then you go to the cryoprotein rest for head retention. How long would you hold that before you go to the 170 degrees for the mash out?
So a glycoprotein rest is, I would do it for at least 20 minutes. I've seen places go up to even 45 minutes with that rest step. I've been using that rest step a lot recently with our lagers, and I've been doing usually a 30-minute rest at 161. So I'll do my first step for a protein rest at 131 for about 15 minutes. Then I'll do my saccharification rest, you know, around 148 to 152 degrees, depending on the style. Then I'll go up to that glycoprotein rest for 30 minutes at 161, and then up to the mash out temp at, you know, around 168, 169 for 10 minutes.
So, Brian, would that also be applicable for ales as well as lagers?
Yes, it would. It would. You could. Those mash steps are. You could definitely use them for ale brewing as well.
Okay. And the other question which I got was, you said there your diacetyl rest was between 60 and 62 degrees
Yes.
for the lagers. So, I mean, normally when we look at the diacetyl rest, it's normally in the 70s. Is that because it's a specific lager?
So yeah, that if I'm brewing an ale, I'm definitely doing my diacetyl rest at around 71, 72 degrees. But for lagers, you know, as that's on the high end of their fermentation range, typically, they're able to clean up that diacetyl lager yeast strains at, you know, 60, 61, 62 degrees. If you want to go warmer with it, it's only going to make it clean it up a little bit more quickly. So you certainly can do your diacetyl rest for a lager at a warmer temperature. I just find that when I'm brewing, doing my fermentation schedule with a lager, if I, you know, knock out around 48 degrees, and every other day I'm bringing that up to temperature 2 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time I'm getting to the end of that primary fermentation, I've gotten to my diacetyl rest temperature of, you know, around 60 to 62 degrees, and can let that sit for, you know, anywhere from 2 to 5 days. You want to do your sensory on it, taste it, make sure that all that diacetyl's been reabsorbed before you decide to crash it down at that point.
Great, great. I actually never heard of the glycoprotein rest before, but that's really interesting.
So I've got another question.
I'm sorry, Brad. Brian, you can kind of cheat a lager, right, with ale yeast sometimes, or vice versa?
Yeah, so yeah, that's one thing we didn't really get into. There are some styles. When we first talked, when we were talking about lagers, we were also talking about lagering. I mean, there are lagered ale styles out there. You look at Kolsch, you look at alt beer. These are German styles that were fermented with the ale yeast, and then they are cold conditioned. They're lagered for, you know, about a month, 6 weeks after that. So, though, you know, lagering is something that you can do to an ale to achieve some of the same desirable effects that lagering does for, you know, a beer fermented with lager yeast. Similarly, there's, you know, some, you know, other kind of hybrid styles like steam beer, California common beer, that lager strain if you'll look on like White Labs, can ferment at a warmer temperature, around 60 to low 60s degrees Fahrenheit, and still produce a pretty clean tasting beer. They're still going to be, crashing that down and cold conditioning that as well. And then, there's some other yeast strains. I think Cry Havoc, the Papazian strain, is one that's great for brewing kind of lager styles at a warmer temperature in the low 60s as well.
So you mentioned kilning over Coke in British malt houses. I'm going to proclaim ignorance. What the hell does that mean?
So in the past, when these maltsters were kilning, heating the malt to modify it, to break down those proteins, to enhance flavors, there a lot of that heating process was done over essentially wood, and that imparts a lot more smoky character to the malt. So Coke, which I'd have to even look up what exactly it is, but it burns, and it doesn't produce the same kind of smoky character that different wood would impart on malt. So it was a much more neutral and pale color that you got from that indirect heating.
So it's not soda or 80s party drugs.
It is not soda or an 80s party drug.
I've got one more question if nobody else does. I'm curious, you mentioned a little bit about the economics commercially for doing lagering. Like, it consumes a tank for a long amount of time, but if you're saying that, a lot of these tanks that people are buying or have overbought, it isn't an issue. Is it, are you seeing that these lagers are selling well enough that it warrants keeping them in the commercial tanks for that amount of time?
So our lagers, and we've typically only had 1 or 2 lagers on tap at any time, simply because of capacity restraints, but they always tend to be, one of our top sellers, definitely one of our top 3 sellers. It's usually IPA, Pilsner, or, some days. I know last summer, our Mexican lager did extremely well for us, and there were definitely a few Saturdays where it was our number 1 selling beer. From the economic standpoint, if you've got the capacity, I say definitely, given how much they're trending and how popular lager styles are becoming with consumers right now, you'd be kind of a fool to not try to play around in that space a little bit, assuming you can, ultimately make a good lager. They are a little more challenging styles to make, certainly, than ales. But also, just from the economics of it, it can be challenging if you're not rebrewing and brewing a lager regularly, because the biggest cost, if you're just going to do a one-off lager, is going to be your yeast that you're buying. And if you're not repitching that yeast for multiple batches, that's going to significantly increase your batch costs to the point where it's not going to be as economically advantageous as brewing an ale with your house ale yeast strain. But yeah, they've been selling very well for us.
So Brian, on a business standpoint, right, on a dollar standpoint, when I think of what I do for a living, and I think of things that sit on the shelf a little bit longer, right? So things that age, is there an impact to margin with a lager over an ale that you can get out and pour rather quickly? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I certainly like that. Most lager styles tend to have a longer shelf life than your popular IPAs of the world. So that's certainly helpful. I mean, a non-hoppy ale style, you'd kind of be in the same boat there. But definitely, if you're sending a lot of product out, as soon as you send your product out from the brewery, you lose a lot of control over that. So it's nice when when you're sending out a lot of a style that's a little bit more shelf stable, a little more flavor stable, like most lager styles are going to be, compared to your hoppier styles that just do not age very gracefully, and you really have to rely on just moving them as quickly as you possibly can.
Okay. I think
Anyone else?
Cahill, at least, I think Cahill's got something.
Okay.
Yeah, so Brad, to answer your earlier question, Coke is a fuel that's actually a byproduct of the coal production process. So when you get bituminous coal out of the ground, it's a byproduct of making good coal. And it's actually a very pure fuel as far as burning stuff, which, as Brian was saying, it doesn't impart a lot of flavor because it's basically you burn it and it's all gone. But also I wanted to ask, somebody posted a question in the chat here for the Zoom meeting. Richie Arthurs is asking, Brian, can you explain bright drop?
Bright drop, or a beer dropping bright. Basically that, that's just kind of the term brewers use to talk about the clarification process that happens when you've got, when you cold crash a beer, the precipitation, all the solids, a lot of the proteins, a lot of the yeast that's still in suspension, that's going to drop out of suspension to the bottom of the tank, aka drop bright.
Thank you. Brian, I have a question. I do have a question if nobody else does.
True, Jim.
Okay, so from a home brewing perspective, and I understand from a commercial viewpoint, you probably have a lot of tools for this, but if you're looking at 10 to 12 weeks for lager to be ready to serve, it's a lot of time to get your hopes up and anticipation up and friends' hopes up. Like, what are the checkpoints, or are there checkpoints or milestones along the way to gauge whether you've got a really good beer, a decent beer, or you just want to dump it at 8 weeks because it's not going to get any better? Can you determine that along the way, or you really can't really tell until right at the end?
Think, obviously, it's important to monitor, if you can, in a commercial setting, every single day after we brew a beer, we're monitoring its gravity, we're monitoring its pH, and those are big indicators for us to make sure that we're having a healthy fermentation. Most home brewing setups, you're probably going to do more harm than good if you're pulling samples every single day to test it for gravity and pH, just in terms of exposing it to more and more oxygen. So if your setup, if you're just pulling something out with a wine thief or something, I don't know if I'd necessarily recommend that. Obviously, checking your gravity is very important. You want to know when you've hit the terminal gravity, and you want to give it a few days to clean up at a diacetyl rest temperature. One of the most important quality controls instruments that that we have at this brewery, and that you guys have at home, is your tongue. I mean, sensory analysis is vitally important to making sure you've got a good product. I would say it's definitely worth, when you're pulling those samples towards the end of primary fermentation, you're going to want to taste it, and especially to make sure that over the course of the next few days your diacetyl cleans up.
Okay.
So once you've tasted it, and if you can warm up that sample a little bit, like, I don't know if any of you guys have like a sous vide setup, that can be really good to kind of heat your sample up a little bit. When you do that, diacetyl becomes a lot more expressive. So you can, if you take a sample and like heat it up in a recirc bath, to around, close to 100 degrees, and then you can cool it back down and taste it. And if you're getting diacetyl at that point, it needs some more time. Some other good indicators, to make sure you're doing all right along the way. After you've crashed it down, you can taste it. Sulfur is going to be something that takes a little bit of time to clean up in a lager as well, typically. The lower temperatures tend to produce a little bit more sulfur with a lager fermentation compared to a ale fermentation. You're definitely going to experience that smell in the off-gassing during primary fermentation. Fortunately, sulfur is a very volatile compound, so it will eventually off-gas. And but you know that does take some time as well. So that's another thing you want to be tasting for along the way whenever you're pulling samples of your cold crash beer, is how much is that sulfur cleaned up. And then at that point in time, I mean, you know, visually you want to make sure it's as clear as you can get it. If you're using finings like biofine or gelatin, I mean, that clarity is definitely, to me, important, especially in the lager styles, but really all styles, unless it's, of course, a hazy IPA or a Hefeweizen or something to that effect. But, you know, people drink with their eyes first, so it's always important to visually monitor how your beer is progressing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Brian, can I have one last question? I really want to come back to this glycoprotein rest.
Yep.
What, if you don't mind, what actually happens at that rest, Brian?
So that rest is it's similar to what's happening at your protein rest temperature, but you're essentially breaking down. You're breaking off of I think you're actually going to get a glucose molecule that's going to break off during the reaction, and you're going to break down that protein into a medium chain protein that can then form that's better at forming a protein matrix for to increase your head retention at that point in time. So it's taking a protein and making it turning it into a size protein that's going to be foam positive rather than foam negative.
Okay, that's great. I'll try that on my next brew. I've never ever heard of that before. Thanks very much. It's really informative.
There's the good thing with that rest temperature is that you're still in your saccharification range, so you're still converting that starch to sugar at that point in time as well. So that's a good you know, you're kind of killing two birds with one stone with that rest temp as well.
All right,
thank you.
Maybe one more question.
I got a quick question. Just looking at some things like from Brewlosophy in the past, and where they've tried to turn around lagers in about the same time as an ale, and they just typically will bump up the temperatures. I was curious, have you ever tried this? Any concerns, you know, on the homebrew level or commercial level? I was just curious, any experience with that?
For fermenting lagers at warmer temperatures?
Yes, using lager strains.
Yep. Personally, I'd be a little apprehensive of that, simply because that cooler fermentation temperature definitely kind of reduces your fruity character that you're going to get from a lot of esters and phenols. But this is very yeast strain dependent. There are some strains like we mentioned, like the Cry Havoc strain, or Anchor Steam's steam beer strain that can definitely ferment at warmer temperatures. I know of, you know, some brewers that are kind of playing around with some of the Kvik yeast to produce lager-esque styles, since they, you know, that yeast can be pretty clean or fruity depending on what you're ultimately doing with it. But you know, there's other if speed is your biggest concern, there is a high pressure lager yeast from White Labs that a lot of breweries are playing around with right now, that ferments in about the same amount of time that you could ferment a typical ale with, but it's not necessarily something that a home brewer could really play with, because most home brewers aren't fermenting under pressure. So that'd be kind of the limitation with that yeast strain in terms of its application for a home brewer.
Thank you, Brian.
Maybe one more. Anybody?
Rick, I've got one question. You were talking a little bit ago about just the whole fermentation process with lagers and so forth. I've had issues. Well, I'll go back and I've been homebrewing since the mid to late 90s, and virtually all of the things I've ever brewed have been ales. And I've tried my hand at a couple of lagers, and they taste okay. You know, no issues with diacetyl or acetaldehyde, that kind of thing. The issue I have is a little bit of cloudiness. I'd love to get your thoughts on how to address that. If it's a matter of cold crashing longer or what. Thank you.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's obviously a lot of different things that that go into, you know, beer clarity. I'm not sure without knowing what you're doing to attempt to define the beer. Obviously, first and foremost, keeping it cold for you know, a longer period of time is going to help it drop bright. But if you know, if you're having trouble with it, I know we use Browsell Special Biofine, silicon-based fining agent here at Town. A lot of breweries use that. It works, you know, similarly to how, you know, a gelatin is going to work to clarify your beer. But yeah, I mean, I think your mash regime can play into it a little bit as well. Sometimes you can get a protein rest, depending on what temperature you're doing your protein rest, to encourage some clarity by doing a rest more in the like 122 to 125 degree range. That's going to break down some of those haze causing proteins into proteins that are good for yeast health, essentially. But you know, really, lagers are just kind of a labor of love. Time spent cold is your number one tool to producing a clear beer. And then, you know, after that, if you're having trouble getting clarity when you're using fining agents on top of that cold temperature, you know, there could be some other issues there, whether it's maybe cross contamination with a different yeast strain or bacterial strain that's going to throw some haze, or you know, potentially something with your mash contributing some stable haze as well.
Thank you.
All right. Anybody else before we adjourn here? Brian, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the club. Thanks to a couple CBMers for coming and visiting us tonight as well. That was a great presentation, everybody. Thanks. Well, clap.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Yeah, this was great. It's always it's nice to be able to find some ways to still engage with the community during all of this.
Yeah. So thanks, Brian. From the education perspective, we really appreciate it, and I know you put a lot of effort into this presentation tonight. Also, you know, with the brewery, you know, in the position it is, you know, serving and working all the hours you are. So we really appreciate the effort you put into this tonight. So thank you very much indeed.
Yeah. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thanks, Brian.
Before we adjourn, folks, before we adjourn, I will draw the 5. I've already drawn the 5 names. So before we do that, special thanks to Rick Heiberg for loaning us the Zoom for the club meeting this month. We may have to use it again next month, Rick, if you're not using it. So thank you.
No worries.
And our winners are, one second, Phil Bassey, Chris Alosi, Matthew Morris, Cahill, and Landon. Those are the 5 winners of the raffle ticket. Again, support local, go out, take your pictures, buy some crawlers, go visit Brian. Don't shake any hands yet. You can bump his elbow or something, but say hi. Mention that you saw him here on the on his presentation. Thanks again, Brian. Thanks again for everyone who attended tonight.
Yeah, Brad, if you send me those names, I'll allocate the ticket numbers against each of those names for the secondary draw.
Very good. All
Sounds
right.
great.
Good night, all.
Sir,
Thank you.
I will edit some of this video down, and it will be sent off to be on our socials within the next day or two.
Thank you.
Okay.
Awesome. Good stuff.
Bye, all.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hey, don't
Cheers,
edit
y'all.
me out, Rick.
Absolutely.
Thanks, guys.
Hey, Rick, are we going right into a DJ thing now? Or
I mean, we can. I ain't scared. All right, guys. We'll see y'all next month.
Take care.
Thanks, Rick.
You bet.
Thank you, everyone.